And Russia is issuing a warning amid discussions between European leaders, Ukraine, and President Trump. Vladimir Putin says Russia's military would consider any foreign troops in Ukraine before a ceasefire agreement to be legitimate targets. It comes a day after Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelenskyy met in Paris with European leaders while President Trump joined remotely. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Air Force says Russia launched 157 drones and 7 missiles toward Ukraine overnight, while Russia says it downed 92 drones across Russia. ABC Chief Foreign Correspondent Ian Pannell has more on that. So, Ian, Putin also dismissed the idea of peacekeeping forces in Ukraine after a final peace deal. So where does that leave a potential deal?
Yeah, you're right. He did. And that seems to fly in the face of what President Trump said just a few weeks ago, suggesting that Russia was amenable to the idea of foreign troops. And for those of us who have been following the story closely, that seemed a surprising statement. And now Vladimir Putin himself has kind of ruled that out. So he said, yes, foreign troops would be a legitimate target before the end of hostilities, and that there would be, quote, no need for them after, because there would be a peace deal. I think what the skeptics would say, and what you would hear from many Ukrainians, is we're hearing repeated stalling tactics by the Kremlin. There was this invitation by Putin for Volodymyr Zelenskyy to come to Moscow for talks, which anybody will tell you is clearly a non-starter. That any kind of face-to-face talks would have to take place in a neutral country. That this whole process of trying to move forward some kind of discussion about peace or a cessation of hostilities, which President Trump has been advocating, which the meeting in Alaska was supposed to be about, which the meeting that just a few days later in Washington with all those European leaders together with Zelenskyy was supposed to be about. The reality is nothing. Nothing has changed on the ground. The fighting is still going on. The bombing is still going on by Russia, and some attacks by Ukraine on Russian soil. And there is talk about talks, but no real progress.
Ian, Putin says security guarantees would be needed for both Russia and Ukraine. So how do you get that without peacekeeping forces in Ukraine?
Yeah, and what is your interpretation of security guarantees? I mean, Russia certainly at least says, Putin and Kremlin officials have repeatedly said that the reason for what they used to call a special military operation, even now they concede as a war, is that Russia felt NATO was encroaching on its borders. I mean, the reality is NATO is already on some of its other borders, but that this was a step too far. Now, whether or not you believe that argument, I think Russia will argue that it needs to know not only that there's no NATO membership, but probably that there are no NATO troops, that there is no buildup of Ukrainian armed forces. In other words, that there's no threat there. I think what the other side would say is they need a guarantee that Vladimir Putin isn't going to invade Ukraine for a third time. Remember, back in 2014, his forces, local separatists backed by Russia, took over Crimea and parts of the eastern Donbass. And then again, of course, in 2022, they launched that large-scale invasion. Ukrainians just simply don't believe what Vladimir Putin has to say. And they'll also tell you they already had an agreement. They had an agreement when they gave up their nuclear weapons that was signed by the United States, by Bill Clinton, and the British government, by John Major, who was the Prime Minister at the time, basically saying you hand over your nuclear weapons and most of your weapons in exchange for security assurances. Well, that clearly proved to be meaningless. So the Ukrainians have got to have something more tangible. And at the moment, I just don't see any common ground between the two sides.
All right, Ian Pannell for us. Thank you.